welcome to Classics Confidential. Today we are honoured to have Professor Mike Edwards with us to talk about rhetoric. Now, rhetoric has had a bit of a bad reputation. Both the ancients and the moderns have had reservations about it. What's your opinion, Mike?
This is all the fault of Plato. He's done tremendous damage to the study of rhetoric, and one wonders how the Western intellectual and other traditions would have developed if he hadn't have been so damning about my subject, which was to some extent rectified by Aristotle. Although, in my opinion, Aristotle also did untold damage to rhetoric by being so good at it in his treatise and destroying all the treatises that went before him.
So it has had an impact on the transmission and selection of text for transmission?
I think so. You have to balance Plato's criticism against the Isocratean Greco-Roman education system that developed from Isocrates, which in fact has, in many respects, in my opinion, has had a far greater impact on Western civilization even than Plato, through, as I say, through the Greco-Roman education and then through the trivium and quadrivium in the medieval and later periods. So I think we rhetoricians have had our own back in many ways, trying to recoup that loss that Plato caused us. Yeah.
So I think it's already began to answer my next question, which is why Greek rhetoric as a topic. What drew you to it?
Well, I think really, like most of us, you find an inspiring tutor. My tutor was Stephen Usher, who was one of a very small group of scholars in Britain in the 70s, this would be 1970s, who was really interested in the speeches as rhetoric rather than as sources for history and law, etc. And he inspired me to delve into the subject much more deeply. So I owe a great debt to Stephen.
Yeah, I think sometimes that special teacher can really make all the difference.
Yeah, and of course in those days it was, I was at Royal Holloway, but it was one-to-one tuition, and through most of my degree, and then obviously as a doctoral student. It was a wonderful experience.
Oh, excellent. You've done a lot of work editing rhetorical texts and also producing translations of those texts. Can you tell us a little bit about the process and what draws you to it, what inspires you to keep going?
I think being a textual critic is a way of being hypercritical of minutiae that I'm interested in, rather than the kind of broad brush approach. I find it a lot harder to write in general terms. I'm writing an essay on Greek oratory and rhetoric at the moment, which I find much harder to do than to study the minutiae of a manuscript. But I'm interested not only in the orators, the Attic orators themselves, but in the way that their works have been transmitted through the centuries to us. Most recently, of course, many will have heard of the Archimedes Palimpsest, and I was centrally involved in the decipherment of a few pages of the Archimedes Palimpsest, which were texts of Hyperides, the later orator. And this was the most wonderful period of discovering a new text hidden underneath another one.
Yes, like a textual archaeologist in a way.
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. and I felt very privileged to be involved in that with an international team of very good scholars, headed by the late Eric Handley and Pat Easterling and Chris Carey and other tremendous scholars. So it was great working as a team to uncover that new text, which is about a fifth of what we know of Hyperides, who was the second best orator of Greek antiquity.
Which is very exciting when a new text is discovered, and also makes the point that the canon, there's always hope that something new might be discovered. It's not totally fixed.
Well, I think Chris Carey's recent edition of Lysias shows what can be done with papyrological fragments, and that there's so much work still to be done. I'm sure there are many of these texts still lying unread in boxes, perhaps in Oxford and elsewhere. I have a colleague in Athens who I hope to do some work on papyrological fragments with in the near future. So, but of course the Archimedes was an actual manuscript, which is much rarer to find.
So a big find.
It was to us a very big find, especially of course to mathematicians and Archimedes. And also there's a commentary on Aristotle in this text. But as I say, this is a fairly rare discovery, which makes it all more exciting, of course.
Indeed.
But I'm sure there are plenty more texts of oratory in the papyrus fragments.
Fantastic. Well, here's hoping that more will be found. In terms of translating ancient Greek texts in particular, although you've done other work, what's your perspective on that, and how important it is for the transmission of these texts to new audiences?
I think it's very important. As I said earlier, when I was starting, there were very few scholars interested in the orators as orators. And I think the study of the orators has burgeoned in the last 10, 15 years, partly through the accessibility to them through new translations. I was involved in Michael Gagarin's Texas project to translate the whole corpus of orators, which is very nearly completed. And I think in that way giving accessible but fairly literal translations so that you can get the Greek original out of them is vital to our subject. For those many students who we wish to encourage in the subject who just don't have the background in Greek or Latin that would have been the case years ago. I started Latin when I was 7 years old, Greek when I was 9.
Unfortunately, that's a rare.
This is a rare
thing these days.
But I was involved in the period when classical studies was being developed. My department at Queen Mary at the time was one of the leaders of this, and of course it was against the teeth of, or in the teeth of great opposition to studying in translation. But I think translation increasingly plays a vital role in the preservation of our subject.
It's a question of survival. So, you also do a lot of editing work. How does that play into your research interests?
Well, one of the things that revolutionised my own career was to become aware of the International Society for the History of Rhetoric. Part of our earlier conversation would be framed in very different terms if we were talking in America, where the same hostility to rhetoric that you've found in Britain, or in England actually, not Scotland, this simply doesn't exist in North America. where they use rhetoric in composition classes and then as a subject, which is another reason why we need good translations of the Greek text for non-Greek students anyway. But my involvement in the Rhetoric Society led to my becoming the editor of the journal Rhetorica, which is the premier journal in my field. And I was very proud to be editor of Rhetorica.
Yeah, and also comes out in all sorts of different languages, so there's a heavy burden on you as editor. Yeah,
you have the society has it 5 official languages: English, French, German, Spanish, Italian, 6 Latin.
Right.
You can publish in Latin.
Wonderful. Does anyone?
I had a submission just before I ended my term as editor, which I would hope will appear. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, that would be something to look out for.
Yeah.
Just for the pleasure of playing with the language.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about the project that you're currently working on.
Well, as with a lot of people, I have various irons in various fires. My main project is an Oxford text of Isaias, the orator. I did a translation, as I said a few minutes ago, in the Textus series of Isaias, which inspired me to go back to the Greek text when I realised that there wasn't an established text, not an Oxford classical text, for example, which is what I'm working on.
Fantastic.
I also started a project when I was director of the Institute of Classical Studies on translating later rhetorical manuals, which again will have a tremendous audience in North America, as I hope in Great Britain as well, with texts that are sometimes very simple Greek, sometimes more complex, but which have received very little attention in English. There's plenty of French attention recently, but I think there is a great need for more English translations of later rhetorical manuals, both Greek and Latin, and moving into the medieval period.
Yeah, because it's part of the history of the subject as well.
Yes.
And deserves attention.
And especially the Latin medieval treatises give such an insight into the way that education developed from antiquity into the later period. And you have to remember that what seems to be a very specialised subject now was what everybody studied at university until relatively recently.
How times have changed.
Times have changed.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you very much for coming and talking to us on Classics Confidential, and best of luck with your project. We look forward to seeing it when it comes out.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.